Thank you for all of those joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michaela Lewens, and I'm an active member of the Migrant Investor and Entrepreneur Association. So first and foremost, I want to welcome you to today's program. We're going to be discussing Jbwere's Calls Report, and it's a combination. It's co-hosted by Mia, Immigration New Zealand will join us, of course, the Bank of New Zealand, and Jbwere Wealth Management. So I'll briefly go through today's agenda, but as a matter of housekeeping, feel free to ask any questions in the chat function. I'll read them out towards the end of today's session, but it would be great if we could keep it the questions to topic. So if you have any questions related, say, to like immigration policy or like, you can certainly email me or David Wayne directly. I'll put our details in the chat function shortly, and we'll point you in the right direction. But if we can stay on point today, that'd be great. As a little bit of context, over the last year, David Wang and I have been frequently approached by MIA members asking for both sort of for-purpose investment opportunities as well as advice around New Zealand's charitable sector. So today's webinar is really geared towards introducing to you what I'd consider as the thought leaders in this space and some of the opportunities in New Zealand's philanthropic sector. So first today we'll be joined by Matt Hoskins, who will share New Zealand's immigration's perspective and philosophy on philanthropy from like a policy perspective. And then we'll hear from David O'Fell, who's one of our fellow MIA members, and he'll just impart his sort of personal experience in getting established in New Zealand and with a lens towards how you can incorporate the philanthropic sector into your portfolio. And then the real crux of today, we're going to be joined by our co-host Evan Veza from the Bank of New Zealand. He heads up international business there, and his colleagues at Jbwere Wealth Management, John Moore and John McLeod. Both are widely considered leaders in the philanthropic service and are probably the first point of call for anyone thinking about the space. So as it kind of to that point, like when I think of the for-purpose sector, Jbwere has always sprung to mind. From those of you who may not be familiar, Jbwere Wealth Management is a leading wealth manager in New Zealand. They've got the big footprint also in Australia. And as I understand it, they are the only ones who currently have a designated philanthropic service team. They offer advice on for-purpose investment strategies. And I know from experience, they've kept very close tabs on all the philanthropic opportunities available in New Zealand. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Matt from Immigration New Zealand. Hey, Matt, I think I'm just going to ask you to unmute. We couldn't hear you before.
Yep. Hello, kia ora. Yep, all good now. You've unmuted me, so I can speak. Kia ora, everybody. My name's Matt Hoskin. I've led the Investor Migrant Program for the last 12 years, with the last 2 or 3 being particularly challenging, as you can imagine, right across the immigration system. So personally, I'd just like to say it's great to see David in New Zealand. David and I have been in touch many times over the last 2 years, and I know why that grin is as wide as the Auckland Harbour Bridge, David. So congratulations and welcome to New Zealand, mate.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Look, over the last 12 years, first of all, I'd like to say, while my back was turned with border closures, etc., you've gone and rebranded the sector as for purpose as opposed to philanthropy. So that's going to take me a while to wrap my head around that one. But over the last 12 years, there's a question that I've got in my mind. Certainly something when we've engaged with investors, particularly from certain parts of the world, philanthropy is something that really started to come up, particularly when engaging with the investors from the US market. Now, what I'm not sure is the interest in it from a New Zealand perspective because there are more migrant investors in New Zealand, or is it just that New Zealand's caught up? I don't know the answer to that question, but when I was reading the report, there was a line in it that struck me, and that was the activities of the for-purpose sector are the fabric of our society. And when I was thinking about the role that investors and migrants of all types play in New Zealand and their aspirations for coming to New Zealand, that really hit home with me, because for me, that really mirrors the intent that migrants bring with them. all the migrant investors I've met, and there's been a fair few, they're not making a decision based on the bottom line. This is not about the return they can get. Of course, the return is important, I realise that, but migration to New Zealand is what they're after. And it's a decision very much led by their heart. And so I think this discussion around the for-purpose sector is really important, because we should give migrants and investors as holistic an experience and an opportunity as we possibly can, because each migrant journey is as unique as the migrant and their family themselves. And just to finish, I think, what's really important about this is the really underpinning driver for migrants, again, in my experience, is that they want to contribute to New Zealand, whether that be economically, whether that be culturally, whether that be socially. And I think this is just another opportunity for them to do so. And I think it's really good that we're actively talking about this in a way that we probably weren't 10 or 12 years ago. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Michaela.
Thanks, Matt. I think that leads very easily and effortlessly into David O'Fell. As I said, he's one of our migrant investors, and he can kind of share you firsthand his experience in establishing himself in New Zealand. Thanks, David.
Great. Can you hear me okay, Michaela?
Yeah, you're great on my end.
Okay, great. So thank you for having me. Short of a minor hiccup known as COVID, my experience with the process of coming through as a migrant investor was very, very smooth. I felt supported throughout the entire exercise. The Immigration New Zealand folks were great. I got a chance to meet Matt Hoskin early in the process. He was helpful to me when it was hard for me to understand what was going on during this 2-year quiet period. He shared with me what he could. Anthony Moss, Melinda Lehman, and Butch Swindells, all who are representatives in the United States, also reached out regularly to me throughout the course of that process. So I just want to extend kudos to Immigration New Zealand. They did make me feel very cared for and important to them as I came through this process. Number two, around the context of philanthropy. Philanthropy is something that's important to me and my family in the United States where we live. And coming to New Zealand, it was our intent to continue to engage in philanthropic activity as we came here. But not knowing the first thing about what ecosystem existed, Michaela was kind enough to introduce me to John Morrow. And John and I have had a few conversations, and he was super helpful for me to better understand the ecosystem in New Zealand around philanthropy. Clearly there are some rules and regulations about donative funds and where they can be invested, where they have to maintain that donative intent as we migrate from the US to New Zealand. So I felt like I've gotten some clarity around that. The other thing that is important to us in our philanthropy is really understanding the landscape of organization, a nonprofit or for-cause organizations, and trying to get some qualitative information around the nature of these. Donative impact is something that's really important. So, how much of my dollar is actually getting to the mission versus the cost of administration of a nonprofit organization. That's a hot spot for me in terms of our giving. And John has been helpful in helping me understand that landscape. So I'm excited to come here. As Matt said, I just arrived a couple of weeks ago after a 2-year hiatus, but I'm super excited to be here and look forward to engaging in a whole host of aspects in New Zealand, but philanthropy certainly being one of those. So thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, David. That's wonderful. So let me introduce Evan Veza from Bank of New Zealand, who will in turn introduce our main host today, John Morrow and John McLeod. So Evan, welcome.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thanks, Michaela. Thank you. Good morning. Great to be speaking with you from Kaukopakapa, just north of Auckland. Yeah, by way of background, look, I head up the international business for Bank of New Zealand. I've been involved with the Investor Visa program for 14 years. We provide support to families that are navigating their way in the traditional sense. So typically providing banking and investment management to meet visa requirements. But as a result of that work, we've developed a unique observation point and see the many challenges that families have, but also the potential and the personal goals and aspirations that they bring to our communities, which in my view really adds and contributes to New Zealand's longer term prosperity. And as a major New Zealand bank here, we reach into all regions and sectors of the New Zealand economy, and now playing a much greater role beyond traditional banking, with an ultimate sort of purpose of building a stronger New Zealand. And for new migrants, I recognise that, being in the space for quite some time, that sourcing information, insights, research, finding those networks, understanding the options available is not easy and it takes time. So today's topic and presentation is an example of how we can provide that support via our sister company, Jbwere. So I'll hand over to our presenters shortly, but just to provide some context around the relationship between BNZ and Jbwere. So we share the same parent company, which is the National Australia Bank. This allows us to collaborate in areas that are complementary to both organisations and our customers' interests. And we're very much in a privileged position to be able to contribute and help families better understand the for-purpose sector and to personalise their giving in New Zealand. Now on Jbwere, Jbwere is a leading provider of investment management and philanthropic services to the for-purpose sector in New Zealand and Australia. Currently entrusted with funds under management of just over 12 billion for purpose-led clients. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our two presenters and the co-authors of the New Zealand Court Report. We have John Morrow, who's joining us from Auckland, where he's the head of philanthropy for Jbwere New Zealand and has over 20 years experience in supporting philanthropic individuals and families, as well as for-purpose organisations. Our second presenter is John McLeod, who's joining us from a much earlier time from Melbourne, where he's the leading light in philanthropic and for-purpose research in Australia and the co-founder of the Trans-Tasman Jbwere Philanthropic Services team, which is now in its 21st year. So the two Johns will offer some highlights of their findings in the recent New Zealand Court Report, then turn to providing some observations on the interests of New Zealand philanthropy relative to peers in the UK, Australia, Canada, and the US. And they'll conclude by briefly touching on some of the impacts of COVID disruptions on the New Zealand not-for-profit sector. So on that note, I'll hand over to you, John McLeod, and we can get that presentation underway. Thank you.
Hi, Evan. Actually, you're handing over to me, so that's good. Thank you for that, Evan. Inga mana, inga waka, inga reo, inga rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Mia, for the opportunity for John McLeod and I to participate in this forum today, and we look forward to sharing some of our research insights to this forum, to this group and your members. If I may begin, I think I've just been clicked out. Can people still see me here? That's right. Yeah, well, I think we've got a screen. But if I may begin, can I just offer some context on how we fit into the wealth management firm for Jbwere? And thank you, Michaela and Evan, for just explaining the broader context of how Jbwere fits into the NAB group and BNZ. But just for your understanding, John and myself and other members of our philanthropic services team work alongside our investment advisors in New Zealand and Australia to provide a holistic approach to serving our clients and their for-purpose intents. So, a core part of our mission, through this combined service, is to support our clients in the creation of lasting and positive impact. And so we do that through the philanthropic services offering, and that includes conducting research and shedding light on real data and insights, so our clients can develop their strategies to be effective in the impact that they are seeking to achieve. This acknowledges that investments that we manage for our charity and our families and philanthropic families and our other for-purpose clients is there not only as a means in itself, but to serve the purpose and to serve a social and environmental purpose particularly. So in 2017, we produced the cause report for New Zealand, which was first one that profiled the charity and the wider for-purpose sector here by Jbwere, and that dimensioned its shape not just at the headline level, but also at the cause area level, and build on some of the work that that others have done before us. And then in 2020, we produced the support report to dimension the total philanthropic giving in New Zealand, which at that time was about $3.8 billion annually. And then in late 2021, we produced the second edition of the cause report, which updates and enhances the earlier 2017 profile and is the subject of today's session. So thanks, David, for coming to the slide. We'll just hold on this one if we can. So what, go next slide, please, David. So I'm conscious of the audience that we're talking to today, and some are on their way or new to New Zealand. Next slide, please, David. I think one back, thanks. One back, thanks. I think we're going forward rather than backwards. We can go back. No, sorry, David. Keep moving up. Can we move up a bit further? Bear with us here. One more. Are you there, David? No. Just one more slide up. There we are. Sorry about that. Sorry, one more slide.
There might be a bit of a delay on his end.
I see. Okay, so let me just if we can just go to the next slide, David. That's it. Great, thank you. The joys of just working together remotely. But thank you for your patience, everyone on this call. So I'm conscious, that the audience here, some are new to New Zealand, like David mentioned. Others are on their way, and so we thought before we just jump into the cause report findings proper, offer a couple of profiles here around the for-purpose sector, and sort of where it's positioned relative to other sectors in New Zealand. So you'll hear the term for purpose, and that sort of is mentioned. Look, hey, this is new. What does this mean? It's a term that we've often, other terms that are often used are, social sector, community sector, third sector, not-for-profit sector. The reason why we've tended to use the for-purpose sector is it recognises it's labelling, the not-for-profit sector often is labelling a sector for what it's not, whereas what we're trying to do is encourage and sort of call it the sector in the way that it's positive and recognises its wider contribution, which is significant in New Zealand. So if just some data points here, top line on it, it does represent about 115,000 organisations in New Zealand, and the charities sector is a subset of that for-purpose sector. 28,000 charities as of this year, just recently. Of that subset, or of the total sector for-purpose sector, the charity sector is the most is the one that has the most income and the most assets. And so most of the economic activity is within those 28,000 charities, not the 115,000. And it does cover most of the cause areas, but there's some cause areas that are not represented within the charity sector, but will be in that other wider group. And so those ones would be, you don't get all the scientific not-for-profits. It's very difficult to often get charity status for sport and cultural development, or especially sport. Some advocacy not-for-profits can't have charity status either. So that just sort of provides sort of some of the one of the profiles. If I go to the next slide, please, David. I'll just highlight another way to sort of cut this up and highlight it. The sector is large in New Zealand, and in terms of that charity subsector, annual income as of 2020 was 24 billion, which is comparative to the business sector annual corporate pre-tax profits of 85 billion. there's you can see the different numbers there. What is interesting more is that often, people don't understand the interrelationships between these groups and how they contribute to wider New Zealand. But the interrelationships here are complex and very interwoven together. And you'll see, we've just completed a study of corporate giving in Australia, and we're doing similar research here in New Zealand, which further highlights this this cross section of support that each of these sectors provides. Just one other marker here is its contribution to total GDP, which is about 12.1 billion, 4%, which represents about 4.2% of total GDP for New Zealand. And that's on a par with the agricultural industry and slightly more than with the primary industry more widely. Next slide, please. And then I think the other one, this is the last profile I'm going to show you, and this comes out of the Living Standards Framework, which our Treasury Department has developed to highlight, or it sort of forms the basis of our wellbeing framework, which is informing government spend, but also all these indicators are now getting covered across all of government activities. And you'll see in this, it's trying to capture sort of the wealth of Aotearoa New Zealand in a much broader context than just its a GDP sort of framework. And within that, the not-for-profit sector and the for-purpose sector is widely represented across these four key wealth areas of natural environment, social cohesion, financial and physical capital, and human capability. Next slide, please. So if I hopefully that was helpful to give you some context of where the for-purpose sector sits in New Zealand. It's large, it's a significant contributor, and it often does cover, like many of similar sectors in our peer countries, it does cover the gaps where business and government aren't providing services that are supporting vulnerable communities. In terms of our cause report, as I mentioned, this is a follow-on from our 2017 report. John McLeod and I both wrote this, and we've drawn this from a number of sort of data sets and triangulated it to represent these findings and have some confidence about them. They do look at not only at the top line numbers, but also go into sort of 19 cause areas. This is an international classification, slightly amended for New Zealand. We do have some anomalies here, or small sort of additions, but in principle, it is the international classification for not-for-profits. And this piece of research, I suppose, because we're such a small country to some extent, we don't have the depth of insights that you'd get, from say the US and Canada and the UK. And so there aren't very many reports like this in New Zealand, and we're happy to be able to offer this and sort of amplify and profile the sector more broadly. Next slide, please. So if I just take you through, we're just going to sort of skim over the sort of highlights reel here on some of the data that's in the report and the findings in the report. And you're most welcome to download a copy of the report from our website. But in terms of some of the trends that are happening, you'll see in New Zealand an increased professionalisation in the health and education sectors. There's more full-timers now in the sector and less part-timers. That's partly, a result of increased professionalisation in those sectors and the requirements of those organisations to meet more demanding health and safety standards that government has called on. But you can't get away, whilst that is part of the mix, a significant portion of, or just how the sector operates in New Zealand is heavily reliant on volunteers. And so you can't look at those numbers without recognising and sort of starting to read about what the volunteering profile would look like within each charity. As you can see, a significant number of Kiwis volunteer a year. I mentioned again its contribution to GDP or its nominal value there. And there is a number of volunteers that are volunteering every week, whether or not that's and you'll see it significantly in faith-based organisations. You see it in sport organisations, and you'll also see it across some of the education sector as well. But there's a whole range there. I think Michelle Kitney, who's the head of Volunteering New Zealand, which is the peak body, can speak to this with far more authority than I can. She's published, or that peak body has published a number of reports, and also profiled the change in the demographics of the sector since COVID. And feel free to go and access their reports from Volunteering New Zealand or from the Institute of Directors. I've got some feedback coming through here. Is that from me or is that from someone else? Can you hear that?
I hear it as well. I'm not sure. John, it appears you're the only one who's unmuted. So
okay, I'll move my phone away. Let's see if it's that. Okay, just bear with me. We'll just keep moving through this. So if we just go to the next slide. So in terms of income and where does most of the income for the sector go to? Predominantly, and probably no surprise, education and health are the major recipients of income into the sector, and more widely, you have a concentration of income with the larger organisations. And that concentration, it's slightly less than 2017 report, but there's still a concentration there. Health and education, as I mentioned, dominate. Sport would rank higher. Sport is a big part of New Zealand culture, and the grassroots sport and the frameworks within that, extensive across the country. The only reason why it doesn't get profiled so much here is many of those sporting organisations, as I mentioned before, are not charities. And a lot of this, our data here was based off the registered charities data set. I think just the other thing, just maybe to call out on this, and is the number of, or the proportion of the income from the sector that comes from earned income, and that's more than just traditional government contracting. There is this rise of social enterprise. There's always been a social enterprise movement in New Zealand. It has a long history here, but this whole new generation of social entrepreneurs that are helping renew some of these old organisations, but also bring new organisations into the sector. Next slide, please. Are you there with us, David? Yeah, so again, a similar profile. This is in terms of the sector, asset sector profile. You'll find, again, education, religion and health, are the dominant subsectors. They obviously have, very specialised assets, often concentrated in the major cities. Property assets too that are represented there, but also financial assets from significant endowments over the years. What you'll just see is sort of the outline just on that right hand graph, the concentration of education in terms of its contribution. Its contribution to the sector, to this profile, it's the most significant one, and then you've also got religious activities and health. I think those are probably not too dissimilar to Australia, and John can speak to this with more authority. But these tend to be in the top three, and just vary slightly depending on sort of valuations. Over the last 3 or 4 years, what you are finding is an increased recognition that property assets and the depreciation costs with those is an overhead that that may, need that, or that can be reviewed. And so you are finding these active conversations within these traditional sectors around the asset mix, and to what extent do some of these the property assets need to be held over the long term to deliver their mission. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide on the New Zealand sort of highlights reel for the cause report, and then I'm going to hand over to John McLeod. So this one here is more or less just highlighting the income growth over the last 10 years. There's been a reasonably healthy sort of surplus. This, by the way, this is pre-COVID, and 7% growth over the last 10, and philanthropy has is a significant proportion of that. But what you've also see here is expenses have also similarly grown at the same rate. So the margins are still very tight, and there is the need, I think, for philanthropy here is really around supporting the areas where government doesn't typically fund or underfunds. And that's normally in the administration overhead, and also in the the grassroots programs that are looking to often solve some of the sort of social environmental issues that others aren't looking at, but had not yet been proven up to the extent that government would want to support. So that that's the challenge, is how can you support the sector to be able to not be so focused on just existing delivery of programs, but also looking at sort of reviewing those programs against mission, and also looking to support sort of new ways in which these operating models can be refined or reviewed to meet the sort of other challenges that the sector is facing post-COVID. At this point, I'm going to hand over to John, and he's going to speak just more widely around sort of the giving profile in New Zealand and the research that we've done there, and also how does that compare relative to some of our the other countries that we reference ourselves against. Over to you, John.
Thanks, John, and I'll pop over to the next slide if I can. Thanks, David. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what philanthropy looks like in New Zealand, and this chart on here just shows all the different elements that make up philanthropy, and that ranges from high net wealth philanthropy, charitable trusts, things like that, to government mandated philanthropy and things like the Lottery Grants Board, community trusts that New Zealand have that are a fairly unique function of New Zealand philanthropy, and then the other normal areas of the mass market, large number of donors giving smaller amounts and bequests, and then corporate giving. So it's got most of the elements that other countries have in terms of philanthropy and its shape. But two of the big differences are the Lottery Grants Board and the community trusts that are unique to New Zealand. And they're one of the reasons that overall philanthropy in New Zealand is very strong. It's over 10% of the charity sector income, which is higher than it is in Australia. I mentioned those unique elements to it, but I think one of the other areas, high net worth philanthropy itself, so charitable trusts or just larger levels of donations, is pretty similar to what we see in Australia. It makes up about 8% of this total level of philanthropy. So it's reasonably strong. It hasn't got quite as high a profile in New Zealand. Certainly it hasn't got the profile that it does in the US. And in Australia, we used to have a fairly quiet level of larger donations. That's becoming more high profile. And I think New Zealand will be heading that way as well. But similar levels overall from there. Interestingly, that high net wealth philanthropy foundations and such, while it's 8% of philanthropy in New Zealand, it's about 19% in the States. So I think there's a long way further to grow for higher net wealth giving as wealth levels have gone up around the world. Similar to lots of other countries, the trends in New Zealand are pretty much the same in terms of we're seeing that growth in structured giving, high net worth giving, corporates, and with an ageing population, bequests are starting to grow as well. And we're seeing that mass market decline as a proportion. So the direction of philanthropy in New Zealand is pretty similar to other countries. It's just you've got a couple of unique elements there. So I might pop over to the next slide, please. Thanks, David. And on this, we're just really showing the breakup of where the money goes, both from philanthropy and total income. And it's interesting if we look, and this is similar in other places as well, the big charities tend to get most of the money, whether it's donations, whether it's just normal government income, whether it's broader income. 91% of the money goes to the top 9% of organisations. So it's very concentrated. And for philanthropy, it's even a little more concentrated than it is for total income. And if we go to things like bequests, it's even more concentrated again. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong from that. The large charities tend to be fairly well resourced, generally very good at producing impact. So we're not saying there's anything wrong, but I guess we are saying that there's a lot of organisations outside of that top 9% that are very worthwhile to consider as well, not just the big names, but it is concentrated. It's a global issue. So the last one that I'll chat to, thanks David, the next slide, looks at what sort of causes are supported in New Zealand, and it compares that to other countries. And again, this is no commentary about good and bad causes. All charity causes are good in my mind. But there are some stark differences between New Zealand and most other countries. Like pretty much all countries, religion is the single largest charity cause area that gets money. And like most other countries, it's declining in terms of countries becoming perhaps a little more secular over time. So the percentages are moving down, but it remains the single largest cause. And New Zealand is one of the largest countries in terms of those causes those donations going to religion. Outside of that, education and medical research does pretty well and sits up there with the high levels we see in the US and the UK. Australia is a lot lower from that, even though it is growing for universities, but it's not of the percentages that we see in other countries. The area that's probably a little bit lower in New Zealand than it is in a few other countries is international aid. And I think a lot of that probably is done domestically through other factors such as government, things like that. And some of the religious groups do support international activities as well. So perhaps some of that percentage being lower there is reflected in the religious numbers being higher. But overall, not too dissimilar with religion being the dominant one, but lots of causes there to support. I might throw back to John to have a little bit of a chat around COVID. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Just if we go to this next slide here, thanks, David. So I'll just to finish off, we'll just do a sort of a top line on some of the impacts that COVID has had on the sector, and perhaps for more details, I'm going to reference you to some of the work that's happening within Volunteering New Zealand and Hui, who are major peak bodies for volunteering and also for the not-for-profit sector here in New Zealand. And they've written some good reports, and I've referenced those below. But if I could just maybe sort of summarise, where things are at, not dissimilar to sort of, I'm sure the countries where you've come from. The sector has faced, significantly more challenges in sort of supporting and delivering on its commitments to its communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that's not only just in terms of the COVID disruptions and delivery of service, but also in terms of the fundraising side. So, as I mentioned, I think 19% of the sector is reliant on philanthropy, and fundraising got much harder, especially in 2021 when we estimated it was down by 12%. That's 12% of that 3.8 billion in total. The hardest was sports and arts because of the face-to-face contacts, and then also the most vulnerable population, which had greater demand on their services. I think just one sort of thing to note, and it's at the social services. So the government does rely on the not-for-profit sector or the for-purpose sector to deliver a lot of their programs. And there is, a contracting process, procurement process that happens within that. That often creates quite a lot of competition within the charities and the other for-purpose organisations. And a lot of those contracts are attended for without without being fully costed in. And so Martin Jenkins, which is an independent, respectable consultant here in New Zealand, did a report on that, specifically on the social services organisations in New Zealand, and found that they are underfunded by about 630 million a year. So what I think it highlights is, there's great work happening within that sector. It's an important part of New Zealand in terms of ensuring that New Zealand does flourish, and it provides that that fabric to other parts of society. But it's still not in a financially sustainable state, and that's where the challenges remain. I can speak. We can speak more to that. I can refer you to other people, if you want to look at that, more closely in terms of specific sub-cause areas which are in greater need than others. But for now, I'll just maybe pause on that point, and if we just go to the final slide. Yeah, sorry, just maybe we can leave on that one. That's fine, David. So just in terms of just maybe highlighting, what you've heard today is just an example of sort of the knowledge that we have, within the philanthropic services team. There's 7 of us covering both New Zealand and Australia. And if you wanted to be, more involved in philanthropy here, or you want to talk further around sort of, some of the things we've discussed today, then feel free to contact me, and there'll be a contact sheet here that you can reach me from. But more specifically, we do offer charity giving plans, advice on charity giving plans as they relate to New Zealand. And for those who want to be more structured with their giving, I'm happy to brief you about what that looks like. I also understand Mia is going to be doing an in-person presentation where I'll do a deeper dive on philanthropy, but I'm also going to bring in a sort of a very innovative philanthropic family here in New Zealand to provide sort of a live case study to yourselves of just how it does express itself here in New Zealand, and what some of the work that's been done. I believe that session will also include a tax advisor to cover tax deductibility. But I'll leave that. So just to highlight, there's a number of opportunities going forward to help sort of build your understanding of the philanthropic space in New Zealand, and how to move into this area. And I'll let David provide you with more details about this as it firms up. But on that point, Michaela, maybe I'll just let you to sort of take the lead from here, and open it up for any questions or comments, observations that people might have. Happy for John and I to sort of answer those as best as we can.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm just monitoring the chat, and it appears no questions have come through yet. So feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll read them out for John and John to answer. But it's until that comes through. I mean, this has been it's a fantastic introduction. And as John referenced, well, now that the sort of COVID wave, and at least in New Zealand, is starting to wane, we're planning a lot more in-person events. And the really exciting one will be a follow-up to this. And as John mentioned, we will invite a family to kind of explain their journey, which will kind of put it in context and give it a lot more flesh, and kind of make it more realistic. But it's clear, that migrant investors have a key role to play, I think, in this sector. Certainly, it's a little bit underdeveloped. It's starting to grow, and it'd be fantastic if we can catch up to the US at that 19% mark. But there is obviously like a lot of movement, and with, what was it, 28,000 charities across 19 causes. There's certainly a lot of opportunity, and a lot of, areas that would really benefit from migrants' contribution. Still not seeing any questions. So what I'll do is put both John's details in the chat. You're welcome to email them. It's also on the screen. Feel free to email myself or David from Mia, and we kind of act as a little bit of a Rolodex. So any queries that you might have, we'll sub in someone that we consider to be, I guess, like a specialist or a thought leader in that area. So unless I've got any other questions.
Michaela, maybe I could just come in and just expand a little bit on what we do here, to the extent of that people may be interested. Obviously, how you can, we think about impact more holistically, not only so on the philanthropic side, but the investment side, and how you can sort of deliver impact through both portfolios. And then the intersection between that is often, impact investing. And so to the extent that, there was interest within this cohort around impact investing, I'm happy to speak to that more about how that's developing here in New Zealand. We do keep a register of all unlisted impact investments that are currently available to wholesale investors in New Zealand. And so we can sort of provide, we don't make recommendations on them. Unfortunately, the size of those deals is so small that we can't do the due diligence ourselves. But what we do is we make you aware of what's there, and we try to keep abreast of what's out there right now. And also, we do have some tools that we make available to our investment committees around how to assess not only the financial return and financial risk of those investments, but also the impact return and the impact risk of those investments. So maybe just a highlight, that's part of what we do, and I can, if Mia wanted, if there's some interest from the members around that, I can come back and speak to that at some other point.
Great. We do have one question that you've answered a little bit, but I'll just read it out from David. It's, John, is there a roadmap that might lay out some of the practical steps in connecting with migrant donor advice, funds, foundation funds to New Zealand's, so as to not compromise their tax status, which is a key question I'm sure is on most migrant investors' minds. Certainly ones from America with a global tax system.
Yeah, so there's, I'll throw this back to Evan as well, but I'll make some comments on this. So there's already people that have gone before you. So there's already migrant investors from the US who are philanthropic that, like David, who will be able to provide advice. But also, we are aware of sort of, tax experts here that have specialist experience in this area, and so we'd be happy to make those names available to you if that was interest. We don't give specific tax advice ourselves, but we can definitely put you in touch with the people that do. I don't know if Evan, you've got any other sort of comments on that, or John McLeod as well.
John, I'm just going to ask you to unmute. Same with John.
Yeah, I'll only make a brief comment. I won't attempt to be a tax expert for New Zealand, but certainly in Australia, it's possible, and I'm very aware from both the UK side and the US of that happening. And I would imagine if it's possible over here, and New Zealand's tax and system is very close to the UK's, I know. So I would think it's possible, but yeah, get advice, because all funds can tend to be a little bit different as well. So I think it's doable, but get advice.
Yeah, no, nothing else to add from my side. I mean, we outsource tax advice, so we would just bring in someone that could talk to this specifically. I mean, we do come across taxation issues around, the general movement of foreign exchange and financial assets. But again, we just rely on external providers to advise on that.
Great. Another good question that's just come through is asking whether you've seen any evidence of interest kind of from the climate change sector, as it appears it's slightly underweight in this area despite the latest IPCC report.
I'm happy to have a quick go at this and comment on the Australian side as well. I think environment is interesting, and while the percentages for philanthropy to it are relatively low given the seriousness of it both here and internationally, I think there's a lot of investment going in that doesn't go through charities. So there's a lot of activity going on from both corporates, individuals and such that is supporting actions for climate change, but not necessarily through charities that are doing it. So while the percentages are low, I think the activity is a lot better than those percentages show.
Great, thanks for that. That's a good question, Ron. Appreciate it.
I mean, I will just add my little bit to that too. I think definitely, COP26 has raised another, heightened the awareness even further. I think you'll find that charities are actively, the larger charities are actively thinking about this, and more so also within the SDG, what their contribution is to the SDG goals and how they are more intentional about framing that. there's a new initiative that BNZ have just been part of, which I am really keen to have our charities support. So they've just set up, bearing in mind a lot of the charities are small, and so just how they sort of they need to be given sort of frameworks and sort of guidance around just about it, you know, what they can do and what's practical now and how do they do it over a phased approach. And BNZ have supported this climate action toolbox for SMEs, but I've been talking to BNZ and said, look, actually that's relevant, just about, it should be equally relevant to charities, and how can we profile and promote that within the charity sector in New Zealand. So I think you'll find there's, aside from, you know, John's comments, that there's a lot of activity outside of the sector. There's also different initiatives happening within the sector. The larger ones are obviously already onto it, but the smaller ones, how do we help them? And some of these, you know, the work that BNZ is doing, I think, you know, is going to be really helpful as well.
All right, fantastic. I think that's nearing the end of our session today. Just to note that this Zoom is recorded, and we'll definitely make that available not only to the attendees today, but anyone who wasn't able to make the time zones or the time slot today. Can I just open it to the floor with any other questions or ending remarks before I close the session? Okay. That sounds like it's a wrap. So thank you all again, panelists. It's been fantastic having you here. It's been incredibly insightful, and it's a great introduction, excuse me, to this topic. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. And I certainly hope that everyone can join us for the in-person event. I'll circulate an invite close to the time once details are finalized. But anytime, reach out to myself or David or anyone of the panelists. We'll make all of the information available. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you all.
All right, signing off for now. See you all soon.